People assume older men end up alone because they failed at love, but what if the truth is far less comfortable than that? What if they didn't lose the game? They simply stopped playing a version of it that was costing them too much, because from the outside it looks like withdrawal, like quiet resignation, like a man slowly disconnecting from the world around him. But inside that decision, there's often something far more deliberate, something built over years of experience, disappointment, and hard-earned clarity. And that's where most people get it wrong, because they're still looking at his life through the lens of a younger man, a man who still believes that love is supposed to be intense, unpredictable, even a little chaotic, that if it doesn't shake you, it doesn't mean anything. But time changes that equation in ways no one really talks about, because after enough years, enough conversations that go in circles, enough nights where peace is replaced by tension you can't quite explain, a man starts to notice a pattern, not in women, not in relationships, but in the cost of what he keeps calling connection. And once he sees it clearly, once he realizes how much of his energy, his focus, even his sense of stability has been quietly traded away in the name of keeping something alive that never really felt steady to begin with, something shifts, not loudly, not dramatically, but permanently. And from that point on, the question is no longer, how do I make this work? The question becomes something far more honest. Is it even worth it anymore? Michael Carter did not always think this way. In his 30s and even into his 40s, he believed that staying was what defined a good man. That patience meant strength, and that working through tension was simply the price you paid for something meaningful. He remembers sitting across from Linda Brooks at a small kitchen table late at night, both of them exhausted, both of them repeating the same conversation they had already had a dozen times before, slightly different words, same outcome. And back then he told himself this was normal, that all relationships had friction, that if he just explained himself better or stayed calmer or tried harder, things would eventually settle. But what he did not realize at the time was how those moments were accumulating, not as isolated disagreements, but as a constant background noise that never fully turned off. And over the years, that noise followed him everywhere, into his mornings, into his work, into the quiet moments that were supposed to feel like rest. And slowly something inside him began to change. Not all at once, not in a way anyone around him could point to, but in a quiet, almost invisible shift in how he measured his own life. Because where he once asked himself, how do I keep this together, he started asking something far more uncomfortable. Why does this feel like something I have to survive instead of something I get to enjoy? And that question did not go away. It stayed with him, growing clearer with time until it became impossible to ignore. What Michael eventually understood was that it was never about one argument or one difficult moment. It was about the accumulation of small tensions that never truly resolved, the kind that leave a residue in your mind long after the conversation ends. And over time, those moments begin to shape how you feel before anything even happens. He noticed it in subtle ways first. The slight hesitation before answering a simple question, the way his shoulders would tighten when Linda's tone shifted even slightly, the quiet calculation in his head about whether something was worth bringing up or better left unsaid. And that was the moment everything started to become clear, because he realized he was no longer living freely inside his own life. He was managing it, constantly adjusting, constantly anticipating, constantly trying to prevent the next wave of tension before it arrived. And that kind of living has a cost that is not always visible from the outside. It does not show up in dramatic ways. It shows up in exhaustion, in the loss of enthusiasm, in the gradual fading of the version of yourself that once felt relaxed and open. And the hardest part for Michael was admitting that none of this was new. The patterns had been there for years, repeating in slightly different forms. And each time he told himself it would be different, that this time it would settle. But experience had already given him the answer. He just had not been ready to accept it. Yet what made this realization even heavier was understanding what it was actually costing him. Not in obvious ways like time or occasional frustration, but in the quiet erosion of things he used to take for granted. His sleep became lighter, his thoughts more crowded. Even simple moments like a quiet morning with coffee no longer felt fully his, because part of his mind was always carrying something unresolved from the day before. And that is the part most people never see. They see a man who has a home, a relationship, a life that looks stable on the surface, but they do not see the constant mental negotiation happening underneath it, the subtle loss of control over his own emotional environment. And over time, Michael began to notice something else that unsettled him even more. He was no longer reacting to what was happening. He was reacting to what might happen, shaping his words carefully, holding back opinions, choosing silence not because he agreed, but because he knew where certain conversations would lead, and in doing that he was slowly stepping away from himself, not in a dramatic way, but in small decisions repeated every single day. And that is when the weight of it finally became undeniable, because it was no longer about keeping a relationship together. It was about how much of himself he was quietly giving up to do it. And that question, once fully seen, does not easily disappear. What made it even more difficult to ignore was the realization that this was not unique to Linda or even to this particular relationship. It was a pattern Michael had seen before, not always in the same form, but always with the same underlying structure. A strong beginning filled with connection and promise, followed by a slow shift in attention, misalignment, and emotional strain. And for years he had treated each situation as if it were separate, as if the outcome depended on the specific person or the specific circumstance. But experience had quietly been teaching him something far more consistent, that's certain. Dynamics do not change just because you want them to, and that recognition did not make him bitter. It made him precise, because instead of asking, "How do I fix this?" he began asking, "Do I even want to repeat this again?" And that question carried a different kind of weight, one that did not rely on hope or intention, but on evidence, on what he had already lived through and understood at a level that no advice or outside opinion could override. And for the first time, he stopped seeing relationships as something to prove himself through, and started seeing them as something that either added to his life or quietly took from it. And once that shift happened, once he began measuring experiences by how they actually felt over time, rather than how they were supposed to feel, the idea of stepping away no longer felt like giving up. It felt like choosing with clarity instead of reacting out of habit. The moment that changed everything for Michael did not come during an argument or a dramatic turning point. It came in silence. One early morning, sitting alone in his living room with a cup of coffee. No tension in the air, no anticipation of a difficult conversation, just stillness. And for the first time in a long time, he noticed how different that felt. Not empty, not lonely, but clear, like his mind was no longer carrying the weight of something unresolved. And that clarity hit him in a way nothing else had, because it made something undeniable. He realized that peace was not something he had been experiencing consistently. It was something he had been briefly recovering between disruptions, and that shift in perspective changed how he saw everything. Because once you recognize that your calm only exists in the absence of tension rather than as a stable part of your life, you start to question why that tension is there at all. And for Michael, that question was not theoretical anymore. It was personal. It was measurable in how he felt day to day, and how his energy returned when nothing was pulling at him, and how quickly it drained when it was. And that is when the real conflict surfaced, not between him and Linda, but within himself, because staying meant continuing a cycle he now fully understood, and leaving meant facing something he had spent years avoiding, the idea of being alone. But for the first time, that idea no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a possibility he had not seriously considered before. The moment that changed everything for Michael did not come during an argument or a dramatic turning point. It came in silence. One early morning, sitting alone in his living room with a cup of coffee. No tension in the air, no anticipation of a difficult conversation, just stillness. And for the first time in a long time, he noticed how different that felt. Not empty, not lonely, but clear, like his mind was no longer carrying the weight of something unresolved. And that clarity hit him in a way nothing else had, because it made something undeniable. He realized that peace was not something he had been experiencing consistently. It was something he had been briefly recovering between disruptions. And that shift in perspective changed how he saw everything. Because once you recognize that your calm only exists in the absence of tension rather than as a stable part of your life, you start to question why that tension is there at all. And for Michael, that question was not theoretical anymore. It was personal, It was measurable in how he felt day to day, and how his energy returned when nothing was pulling at him, and how quickly it drained when it was. And that is when the real conflict surfaced, not between him and Linda, but within himself, because staying meant continuing a cycle he now fully understood, and leaving meant facing something he had spent years avoiding, the idea of being alone. But for the first time, that idea, it no longer felt like a loss. It felt like a possibility he had not seriously considered before. What surprised Michael the most was not the silence itself, but how quickly it began to feel natural, as if something in him had been waiting for it for years without ever fully realizing it. He started to notice small details that used to go overlooked, the way his mornings unfolded without tension, the absence of that subtle pressure to manage someone else's emotional state, the simple freedom of moving through his day without anticipating conflict, and none of it felt empty. It felt stable, and that distinction mattered more than he expected, because for most of his life, stability had been something he associated with routine, with responsibility, with obligation, but now it felt like something else entirely. It felt like relief, and that realization forced him to confront a truth he had avoided for a long time, that much of what he once labeled as connection had actually been a constant negotiation of boundaries he never clearly set. And now that he experienced what it felt like to not negotiate at all, to simply exist without adjusting himself in response to someone else's unpredictability, the contrast became impossible to ignore, because once you know what it feels like to be at ease in your own space, anything that disrupts that begins to stand out immediately, not as something exciting or passionate, but as something costly. And for Michael, that cost was no longer abstract. It was measured in how he felt in his own life. And once that awareness settles in, it quietly reshapes every decision that follows. In the end, what Michael understood was something most people never take the time to see clearly, that the real value in his life was not found in proving he could stay or endure or make something work at any cost. It was found in protecting the parts of his life that actually made him feel whole, the quiet mornings, the steady rhythm of his days, the ability to think without pressure, to exist without constantly adjusting himself to keep the peace. And once he experienced that consistently, not as a break between problems, but as his baseline, everything else started to look different, not worse, just heavier than it needed to be. And that is the part that often gets misunderstood, because from the outside, it looks like he has stepped away from something valuable. But from his perspective, he has stepped into something he spent decades overlooking, a life that does not require constant negotiation to maintain. And that does not mean he has closed himself off to connection. It means he has raised the standard for what qualifies as one, because connection without stability is no longer appealing, and attention without